everybody. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. After a 2-week hiatus, we are back and probably better than ever. Is that fair to say, Jacob?
Rumors of my demise have been much exaggerated, Cole.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm going to. Jacob was sick for a while, and I myself, I was on this thing. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called vacation, and what you do is you don't work for a while. It's amazing. I'm gonna try and do it again sometime. Which is a way to say, too, that we've got a lot to catch up on. Even if we weren't gone for an entire week, we have a lot to catch up on. This week is a particularly busy week, too. We've got Israeli embassy moving May 14th. We had the Iran deal expiring May 12th, although today, as of this recording, Trump has already announced that he is going to decide one way or another in just a couple hours. We may or may not have published this by then. Stay tuned. Possible dates and locations for North Korea talks. U.S. midterm elections start today. There's NAFTA talks and lots going on. So instead of having a primary feature on this particular podcast, I thought it might be nice to just catch up, and the whole thing's going to be a week ahead. What do you think about that?
That sounds great, Cole. I'm game.
Okay, then start talking. What do you got? Let's start with Iran. You want to start with Iran?
We can start with Iran. This podcast will probably publish shortly after Trump makes his announcement. But honestly, I think that whether or not he reneges on the deal, and I mean, we expect him to renege on the deal.
That's what all the signs are pointing to, but who knows with him, right?
Well, there hasn't been a leak, which is rare in the Trump administration. Usually these decisions have come out before the decision is actually announced by Trump. So just the fact that there has been no leak is somewhat telling. But I think that increased hostility between Iran and the United States is already priced in the sense that, look, Iran and the United States, ever since the Islamic State's abilities were severely degraded, have really not been seen eye to eye. Iran has a domestic national security imperative to expand into the Middle East, and the United States does not want to see any dominant power come up in the Middle East, whether it's Iran or Turkey or the Islamic State. Iran also has been testing its missile program, which North Korea ran afoul of the United States for its missile program. So, and this is something that has been pointed out by many commentators, but it's worth restating. The Iran nuclear deal deals only with uranium enrichment.
It has nothing to do with its ballistic missile program, has nothing to do with its conventional military, it has nothing to do with its expansionist tendencies, correct?
It has nothing to do with anything else, right. Which is probably the reason that it's not a particularly effective deal, particularly because both in the United States and Iran, it was very, very controversial. And both the Obama administration and the Rouhani administration had to sell it as this big historical moment, Iran and the United States burying the hatchet, dealing with each other on a more pragmatic basis for the first time really since 1979. But the actual content of the deal didn't live up to all that. This wasn't an agreement between Iran and the U.S. for how relations were going to go forward. It wasn't an agreement about what the future of Iran's aspirations and ambitions in the Middle East is going to look like. It was literally just a deal that says, okay, Iran, you give up some centrifuges and you give up some enriched uranium, and the U.S. and its partners will take sanctions off. And that was all that it decided. So it became this huge political totem for different factions in both Iran and the United States, when in reality, it was a very, very limited deal about a very, very limited set of things.
That's true, but is that not also the definition of pragmatism, right? So, I think it does undersells the agreement a little bit, imperfect though it may be. It is sort of a pragmatic victory because there hadn't been really any cooperation other than some behind the doors military cooperation between Iran and the United States, like in the Iraq War. But that aside, if this gets scrapped, for better or worse, this is a victory for the hardliners in both countries.
Look, I have to disagree with you that it's an example of pragmatism, because an example of, let's say, pragmatism in U.S. foreign policy is Nixon going to China. And, you can read, Kissinger's book is great. It goes into sort of the behind-the-scenes details of how it all happened and the intrigue and the various signs that were missed by both sides. But that was a situation in which China and the United States, which did not have much of a relationship, saw the Soviet Union as a common enemy and decided that they were going to align themselves politically, economically, even from a de facto security perspective, in order to combat a common foe.
Nixon did more in China, but you replace what you just said. What you just said, replace Russia, or the Soviet Union rather, with the Islamic State, and that's exactly why the United States and Iran. I'm not trying to overblow this, don't get me wrong, but it is, like, it really is, like, not nothing, is what I'm saying.
I'm not sure about that.
You think it's nothing?
Well, I don't want to go that far, because then people are going to say, oh, Shapiro says the Iran deal means nothing. But I do want to say that, when Nixon went to China, Nixon was in a strong position domestically. He had his own very anti-communist, he had he was known as an anti-communist. His credentials in that sense were very, very strong. He was doing that from a position of strength, and there was real cooperation and real understanding between the two sides. The Iran nuclear deal, there was a common enemy. I don't think there was that real understanding, because there was a very, very different sense of what would happen after the Islamic State ended, or once the Islamic State was defeated between the United States and between Iran than there was, say, between the United States and China if the Soviet Union was going to collapse. The best example of this is the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Only now are the US and China really starting to butt heads, because some of those economic realities and some of those strategic realities have changed. But the amazing thing about that deal and why it was so pragmatic was because basically overnight you were able to build trust between the two sides. And trust is an amorphous thing. It's not something we can talk about in geopolitics in terms of a variable or OECD statistics. But Iran and the United States do not trust each other, and they have very, very different views about what the Middle East is going to look like in their best viewpoints in the next 10 years.
I agree with all that. The last thing I would say, though, is just that during the Cold War, I think international relations were not easier, but it was more simplified. If it's bipolar, it's bipolar, and that kind of creates strange bedfellows almost naturally. Whereas I think if you've been paying any attention to the Middle East, you probably understand that, like, it's just a lot more complicated. I think that's fair to say, right?
It is. And just to piggyback on one of the points that you've made, if you were just looking at hardcore interests, the United States is not necessarily interested in bringing down Iran.
No. Yeah, for all worth noting, for all the talk and bluster about, like, regime change in Iran, I don't think that's, like, the ultimate objective of the United States.
No, the United States really wants to build a functioning balance of power so that it can stop devoting so many resources to this issue. You saw, one of the things we wrote about earlier this week was that the U.S. has resurrected the Second Fleet. The Second Fleet is supposed to defend the U.S. from enemies in the North Atlantic and on the eastern seaboard. A Pentagon spokesperson said, this is about Russia. We're in a new age of great power competition. We don't have time to be dealing with these brush fires in the Middle East that have been occupying the United States' time for so long. So, what the United States wants out of the Middle East is really a stable enough situation where no one country dominates and the United States can pull out. So it wants those understandings with a country like Turkey, like Iran, like Israel, like Saudi Arabia. And one of the things that you're seeing from the United States is it's not seen eye to eye really with any of these countries. Under the Trump administration, Israel and the United States and Saudi Arabia and the United States have gotten closer than they were under Obama. But these countries all have their own interests.
Right.
The United States really just says, okay, great, just don't go crazy and let us get out of here and everything's going to be fine. So that's the backdrop of this.
Well, you brought it up. Let's talk about Israel real quick. They have been bombing, allegedly bombing, I should say.
They've been bombing. It's fine to say that.
Well, they won't say it. We can. They have been bombing Iranian assets in Syria, right? What kind of fallout do we expect from that? What's Israel up to right now? Conflict imminent. Obviously, Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, is very anti-Iran and very anti the Iran deal, and he gave his big fancy Steve Jobsian presentation about how Iran lied. But all that rhetoric aside, what's going on?
Look, some of this is all just waiting for the Iran deal shoe to drop, right. Whichever way Trump decides to go. It's not good for Iran right now to retaliate against Israeli airstrikes because Iran is trying to convince the rest of the international community that it is peaceful, that it has no interest in developing nuclear weapons or being hostile and aggressive. So in this sense, Iran kind of has its hands tied behind its back. And Israel, I think, is hitting Iran when it wants to in Syria, but it is expecting a response eventually. And Iran cannot sit on its hands and get hit by Israel over and over and over in Syria. And I mean, Iranians are getting hit in Syria. That's the difference here.
Yes.
Israel has been carrying out operations in Syria for years now, but the difference is that they are directly targeting Iranians. Now, the problem is, if you look at a map, Iran and Israel are very far away from each other. They can't really fight a conventional war. So that means that Iran has to rely on its proxies. And the proxy that can hit Israel is Hezbollah. So it has been over a decade since the last real Israel-Hezbollah conflict. That was a conflict that Hezbollah acquitted itself fairly well in. But I think every step Israel takes to prevent weapons transfers to Hezbollah, and every step Israel takes in bombing Iranian bases within Syria, I think brings forward the time of the next Israel-Hezbollah confrontation. And that really is Iran using a proxy to try and strike at Israel because it can't do so directly.
I would also say just always be mindful of domestic politics. Lebanon just had some elections, and Hezbollah fared fairly well in those. And with the potential scrapping of the Iran deal, you've got, that really hurts Iranian President Rouhani, right? And so he's going to have to defend his position. The economy is not so well in Iran, and we've talked about that on the podcast and elsewhere, so I won't get into that, but just always remember domestic politics are an issue we need to pay attention to, and that kind of compels people's behavior one way or another. Moving on, though, you just talked about the Second Fleet. I want to talk about that a little bit because you mentioned Russia. Let's talk about Russia a little bit. Vladimir Putin just got re-inaugurated, right? So congratulations, a hearty, heartfelt congratulations from us to Vladimir Putin. This is about 18 years in power. I read a nice stat. This is not my stat. I read it somewhere else, and I forget where, so I can't give it credit. But when he first came to power, Italy had a larger economy than China, which is hilarious.
Well, there's been a lot of press about Russia in the news. There always is. Navalny, who's the main opposition figure, was arrested over the weekend leading some protests before Putin's inauguration. If you want to know, though, what's going on with Russia right now, it really comes down to this. Brent crude prices are
back up.
They're back. They're about over 75 a barrel. We've written pieces before that say the Russians need the price to average in the year about 68 to 70 in order to balance that budget and be okay. If the Iran deal is scrapped, I expect a small spike in the price of oil as well, which is to say Russia's doing okay right now. And the Putin government, for those, there is certainly opposition within Russia to it, but the Putin government is still very popular. And as long as oil is high enough that Russia can make that budget, can make ends meet and can balance that budget, there's not a whole lot to see here. I think Russia is is basically doing okay, which is not something you hear from us very often.
Yeah, that's true. How then do you account for some of the recently announced budget cuts to its military? According to SIPRI, it was something like, I want to say 20%. I don't have the figures in front of me. Russia said it wasn't quite that high, but did confirm that they had kind of like slashed their military budget.
I respect SIPRI very much, but if you this happens with data. If you pick an arbitrary date and then pick another arbitrary date 12 months later, you can sometimes miss reimbursements or different banking systems that account for the money differently. So if you take into account some other statistics, you can find them on our website. It wasn't that much of a drop. It was just a few percent. But again, these are the publicly stated figures. You asked, what is my response to Russia cutting defense spending? I don't believe it. I don't think Russia's cutting defense spending.
They said they did.
Well, that's nice that they said they did. I said that I have a pony, but I don't. Well, I used to when I was a young man.
I would say it's like more accurate.
When I grew up on the farm, but I no longer have a pony. They don't allow that. There's no pony deposit at the apartment complex.
You got to settle for your fish.
But no, I mean, if Russia is announcing all these new weapons that it's developing, if it's trying to reorganize its force structure, it's not cutting its military budget. Now, one of the things here is that the defense portion of the Russian budget every year is never really made public either. I mean, Russia is very open about the fact that there are certain things that are just not going to be revealed publicly. It is in Russia's interest to project that it is decreasing defense spending. That shows that it feels strong, that it feels that it can distribute some of that money. And certainly, if oil prices can stay like this for the year, that's great for Russia. That means that the reckoning that is coming, is delayed until the oversupply fundamentals come and reassert themselves. But, overall, no, I don't think Russia's cutting defense spending. The model still stays in place. But if you're in Moscow right now, Putin is back in power. The opposition has been fairly weak thus far. Oil's high, and everything's just about going the way Russia wants it to go. The only thing that Russia has not been able to do is really respond to that big, U.S., British, French strike in Syria against chemical weapons. And I think on that, Russia's really just trying to. The more it can keep those countries involved in Syria and talking to it, the better.
How does Russia feel about the Iran deal and its potential undoing? Anything? Benign neutrality?
Well, look, Russia was part of the group that agreed to drop sanctions. I don't think that Russia particularly wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon or wants to see a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. It certainly doesn't want Turkey to feel like it needs to develop a nuclear weapon. Remember, Russia and Iran are partners of convenience. There's a great deal of mistrust going back centuries between Russia and Iran as well. So I don't think that Russia wants to see Iran become all-powerful either. And this is where the nuclear deal is really, it's a sideshow. Like, the reason Iran would develop a nuclear weapon is to try and become more powerful in the Middle East. If you're looking at the political situation and you want a policy of preventing Iran from getting nukes is going to make them weaker in the Middle East, or is going to prevent them from asserting power in the Middle East, then you're going to be for the Iran deal. If you watch events, though, you see that just because Iran has not actually become weaker in the Middle East because of the nuclear deal, it's become stronger. There's money flowing into Iran now that wasn't before. It's fixing some of its missile programs. It's trying to acquire more technology. It's more involved in territory abroad. So if the goal was to weaken Iran, which that is the goal for Russia eventually, to keep Iran from dominating the region, it's also the goal for the United States, then the Iran nuclear deal is just a tool in your toolkit. And if it's not working, it's not working. Certainly Russia loves the optics of Trump tearing it up and the U.S. withdrawing from another
doing his dirty
multilateral agreement. And Russia can say, well, the United States is off on its own and it's a maverick and it's a cowboy. But that
they want the same thing.
That's all optics, and that's everybody can spin everything the way that they want. When it comes to Iran, Russia and the United States, ironically, have similar viewpoints. They should be strong and stable, but not too ambitious. The United States and Russia just have very different relationships with Iran, in part because of proximity.
Moving on. Let's visit China a little bit. So over the past weekend, there was a lot of ink spilled in the media about Karl Marx's 200th birthday.
Happy birthday, Karl Marx!
Happy birthday, Karl Marx! What a guy! One of the foundational tenets of GPF, right, is that ideology matters, but ideology only sort of matters, right? While in any government, there probably are some true believers, as you might call them, and that's the United States or China or Nigeria or anywhere else in the world. But for us, we think that because of geopolitics and demographic trends and international political economy and all these different things, your ideology is going to be so constrained that you're not necessarily going to be able to exercise or execute that ideology all that much. Now, having said that, over the past weekend, during Karl Marx's birthday celebrations, I don't know what those kinds of celebrations are, but I'm sure they're really, really fun in China, President Xi Jinping lavishly praised him. Right now, and you brought up, and I don't follow China quite as closely, so you brought up, and I thought it was interesting, that Xi is really in to Karl Marx. Can you talk a little bit about his fascination with Marx and how, if at all, that impinges on Chinese policy, or whether it might in the long term? Why is he doing this now so publicly?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think if you were going to celebrate Karl Marx's birthday, I guess you go hunting or fishing in the morning, and then you go home and cook it, and then you read philosophy, because that was the utopia that he imagined in his mind.
Sounds riveting.
It sounds good to me.
It sounds like a good. Anyway, it's fine.
Look, I don't know Xi Jinping, and we generally we don't think in terms of the importance of individuals when it comes to geopolitics. That said, yes, Xi has been trying to reinvigorate the Chinese Communist Party's ideological legitimacy. Under Mao, there was a very strong communist ideological legitimacy. Mao had his very own take on Marxism and Leninism and updated it for China. Deng Xiaoping opened China up, and he made the only ideology really enrich yourself. If you think about how a country is going to evolve from eventually to a fully communist country, you could think about it in those terms. I'll get bookmark that point. I'll get back to it in a bit. But under Deng Xiaoping, money was important. Money the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to enrich you was what made it ideologically, that was its legitimacy, not ideologically. The legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party was enrich yourself. The problem is, and Xi knows this, is that China can't enrich itself anymore at the rate that it was enriching itself before, right? So Xi is dealing with this Chinese Communist Party, which is rife with corruption, which has a number of these princelings who are sons of former officials who do all kinds of crazy things with their money, and they're very showy with their cars, while peasants are in the interior, living on $5 a day. And Xi has done a number of things to rebuild the legitimacy of the Communist Party, because if the Communist Party loses its legitimacy, that's the end. Revolution in China, we go to the next iteration of China, whatever that looks like. Now, Xi has been doing this in a couple different ways. Number one is Chinese nationalism. I think of what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea mainly as nationalism. It's also they're getting practice for their navy, but this is not a serious threat of China pushing the United States out of this zone yet or being able to assert sovereignty. This is China beating on its chest.
It's very demonstrative. More than
we are powerful.
Else, yeah.
These are our claims. China is a very important country, the center of the universe once more, etc. So nationalism is one thing. The second thing is these corruption purges. Xi has been targeting officials who have enriched themselves too much and not enriched others around them as much. He has targeted people who are lying about statistics. He has targeted people who perhaps were even plotting to remove him or to put their own.
Like I forget his name, the governor of Chongqing province,
Bo Xilai. But the thing there is that the Chinese Communist Party was corrupt. So these purges on some level are popular in China because people were seeing the corruption on a daily basis. And Xi has not been doing this like Mao in the sort of cultural revolution chaos way. He has been very carefully identifying those people who have gone too far and cutting them down to size. So he's ending corruption. Now, the last part of this is Marxism. And Xi has definitely been trying to inject Marx back into the conversation. He has put Marxist theorists in high positions of authority within China. If you go back to his big speech back in, I think it was in November, when he basically became dictator of China, there's a whole section about the importance of Marxism and socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, how much Xi believes this or not deep in his soul, I'm not sure. I can tell you for sure, though, that, look, China is a communist country. It thinks of itself as a communist country. Its relationship with Marxism is real. It's intense. It views the world through a Marxist lens. Now, does that mean that the problems of China and its economy and its military are any different? No. But if you want to understand how a Chinese decision maker looks at the world, you do need to take into account that they're learning Marx when they're learning economic theory. So when China is saying, yes, we support an environment in which there is free trade, that's not a liberal principle. That's not coming from, capitalism, and if we have free trade, it's going to make efficiency and everybody's going to get richer, and etc. That's, Marx even said, I think it was Engels actually who was talking about Marx's view of free trade. I was reading up on this morning because I'm a nerd. That free trade was one of the things that actually brought about revolution. So, Marx was sort of for free trade, not because he was for the manufacturers and for the oligarchs and the business classes that were profiting off of them, but because that brought the reckoning of the revolution forward. That was the next step, bringing about the revolution. So I would say this, we have been saying for a while that China is, it has to pull off an incredible economic transition. It has to go from an export-based economy to a consumption-based economy. If you're looking at that through Marxist terms, and I don't want to get too jargony here, you could see that as a natural evolution towards a communist state. China has never been sort of the prototypical Marxist state. Marx was looking at European nation states, after industrialization, and he was predicting that communism was the inevitable political end after the workers rose up in those states. China, even now, is not quite at the level of overall wealth and industrialization that some of those European states that Marx was looking at were talking about. So again, if you're thinking about how maybe Xi Jinping and his cadres think about what's going on in China, you could see that this upcoming major economic upheaval that we've been talking about in Marxist terms also makes a lot of sense. Xi Jinping is expecting it. You can't just go straight to Marx's views of a worker's paradise until you've gone through certain intervening steps. So I think the ironic thing here is, is she a Marxist or not? I'm not sure. Certainly in China, Marxism is still important, and it doesn't matter. The problem is the same. In the same way that we're using geopolitics to say, look, China's facing a major hurdle coming up, she's saying the same thing. He's just saying, hey, Marx expected this. We're exactly on schedule. We're exactly where we should be, and we have to take X, Y, and Z steps. And again, this all goes back not to Marx, not to ideology, but on the Chinese Communist Party maintaining its ability to rule. At the end of the day, he has to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party's authority remains, and Marxism is part of that piece of the puzzle.
Speaking of workers' paradise, you want to move on to North Korea? Or are you nuked out?
I'm not nuked out.
Supposedly, the dates and location for these highly touted nuclear talks between the United States and North Korea are going to be announced soon. So we've been following this for a while. I don't really have much of a preamble here other than to say if the Iran deal is scrapped, you've got United States trying to denuclearize two countries at once, which seems like a tall order, but we've talked about Iran. Let's talk about North Korea specifically. Update our listeners. What's been going on?
Look, we're in a holding pattern here. Until Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump have a meeting, there is a lot of activity, a lot of diplomatic statements, a lot of hand-wringing. None of it really matters. Momentum for some kind of deal. I could give you speculations about what I think is happening on that side. You have Kim actually apparently made a surprise visit to China for the second time in just a month. China is very active here. Japan and South Korea and China are having a summit this week. This is all preamble to the Trump-Kim meeting. And the question here is, as with Iran, can the United States and North Korea find some basis for trusting each other? It's not enough to say that, well, we're going to make this concession and you're going to make this concession. It has to be, is the United States going to believe that North Korea is going to do what it says? Does North Korea believe that the United States is going to do what it says? And a lot of this also goes back to what exactly is North Korea trying to do? Is this North Korea trying to preserve its regime, in which case there's a set of different concessions that it would want? Or is this North Korea wanting to set in motion a process that slowly leads to reunification on its own terms? Is it willing to have reunification not on its own terms? All these things are on the table once you actually sit down, but we'll have to see what comes out of the meeting and whether not just Trump and Kim, but whether the United States and North Korea can find some stable basis on which to relate to each other.
What would you said reunify on its own terms. What would those terms be? Again, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but I guess if Kim wants to reunify the peninsula, that's one thing. But reunifying the peninsula under the suzerainty of Seoul and not Pyongyang, that's totally different, right? So would he accept that?
I don't know. This is an argument that we've been having internally within GPF, and for me it really comes down to, is Kim Jong-un, does he care more about North Korea or does he care more about Korea? Because if you're Kim Jong-un or if you're any South Korean leader, you see China, you see Japan, you see Russia. You're a very, very small country. You need to, close rank and get as many resources under your disposal as possible. If you had unification of Korea, that's now a country of about 75, maybe 80 million people. Certainly there would be economic setbacks from having to integrate the North, but there might also be benefits.
But that also gives this theoretically unified Korea a border with China, which is something that South Korea doesn't have right now and probably doesn't really want, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, like a unified Korea, whether its capital is in Seoul or Pyongyang or in some kind of power sharing agreement between both, a unified Korea that actually, builds its own, an integrated economy and military and political complex is stronger than a divided Korea, period. So if Kim Jong-un is nervous about Xi Jinping's own expansionist tendencies and is nervous about China, or is nervous about something we talk about a lot, which is Japan getting more aggressive and thinking about establishing its own interests.
Yeah, remilitarizing as well.
Koreans on both sides of that demilitarized zone remember very well what Japanese imperial rule looked like. They remember very well what previous Chinese invasions looked like. So again, this all comes down to is there such a thing as a North Korea and a South Korea, or is this really just a masquerade, and the imperatives and the history and the context is what is going to allow Korea to reunify? I think most of the analysis out there, and most of the analysis we've done, has said, no, Kim Jong-un wants to preserve the North Korean regime. He wants to preserve his own power, and it's very hard to argue against that. And we've seen this time and time again from North Korean regimes, where they get friendly for a while, and then they get some concessions, and they yank it back. And that is honestly probably the most likely situation in all of this. But you also can't say just because something happened one way before means it's going to happen that way again. And like I said, I think this comes down to, have North Korea and South Korea developed kind of separate national sensibilities in the way that China and Taiwan have, for instance? Or is there enough impetus on both sides, and is there enough advantage for both sides to make serious concessions and to move forward? Philip Orchard, who has been on this podcast before, was arguing with me this morning. He was saying
it was a good argument, by the way.
It was,
a good argument.
And maybe we'll have that argument on a podcast here coming out, but I don't want to steal his point. But he said that he thought that maybe Kim Jong-un wanted to be the North Korean version of Deng Xiaoping. So that means not giving up the North Korean regime or any of its distinctiveness, but opening it up, enriching it, bringing North Korea into the 21st century, making it so that when you look at North Korea from space, you don't just see a black hole, but you actually see lights and factories and iPhones. So look, the thing about Korea is that it's really tough because there's not a lot of information. You can't get a lot of information unless you're willing to risk your life to go there. And so you're just sort of working with a limited set of variables. Right now, all I can say is that, we are in it's the period where North Korea gets friendly. We've seen this before. Usually North Korea does this and extracts some concessions, and then it gets mean again. I think that's probably the most likely situation. But the reason we are all talking about this so much is we've never seen a North Korean leader go as far as Kim. We've never seen a North Korean leader come down to South Korea. We haven't seen a North Korean leader go visit China twice in a month, and to so drastically change his tone, on the world stage. So that's what we're watching for. It's probably not a satisfying answer, but that's what we're thinking about.
One last question to that. Suppose it actually does reunify, or there is some sort of understanding. What happens to U.S. power in the region? So U.S. military hard power is not necessarily going anywhere, correct? We've still got our Navy, and we've still got a lot of bases over there, and we still have these partnerships and alliances, and we still have troops in South Korea as well. But you talked about Japan, and you talked about China, and there's a bunch of other countries there that depend on U.S. military, the U.S. military for their security. Does that call anything into question? If the United States can't get its way in North Korea, how are these other countries going to react? Does this recalibrate the balance of power there at all? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
The balance of power is being recalibrated because both China and Japan are becoming stronger, more independent actors. But the Korea question really strikes at the heart of a question that the United States has not figured out since the 1950s. Remember, the Korean War started in part because a U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, left South Korea out of the U.S. security umbrella. And North Korea and the Soviet Union thought the United States was not going to retaliate if they went in because it was left off.
They did.
That's one interpretation of how events went. I say that to say that U.S. strategy and containment in the Pacific was never supposed to include South Korea, because you don't need South Korea to have containment. If you want to contain the Soviet Union or you want to contain China, South Korea is really bonus. I mean, it's not that important. The most important countries are Japan. It's important to keep Taiwan independent. The Philippines is of supreme importance. Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. These countries become important for containing China. So the dirty little secret here is that the United States fought a war because it was the Cold War, and it was this bipolar situation that you were talking about, and we've been frozen in time ever since with this kind of anachronistic situation which doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. So am I saying that the United States is going to withdraw from South Korea? No. But I am saying that, look, the United States is not the completely dominant power in the Pacific that it once was. And the United States now will focus on that archipelago of containment. So that's Japan becomes an incredibly important relationship. We have seen the U.S. getting a little stronger with Taiwan, being willing to mess with Taiwan in a way that it probably hasn't in decades. The Philippines is a very, very important relationship right now for the United States. So this is where the United States is going to have to focus its energies. And China, if you look at China's military developments, at its political developments, its economic developments, it is all about trying to build Chinese power against that containment zone. So I think that's what that looks like. The United States has never been very good at being on the Asian continent and intervening in affairs. South Korea is on the Asian continent. It's a peninsula, but it's on the Asian continent. U.S. power is most powerful in the seas, in containment. And I think that that's where, when we talk about the Second Fleet, when we talk about the Navy reorganizing itself around great power competition, that's the type of thing that the Navy has to gear itself up for. It can't be sending carriers to carry out sorties against the Islamic State when you have to make sure that the containment line in the Western Pacific is holding.
Okay, I've got the list continues. I don't know how much more time we have. Probably not so much more time. I've got Brexit on this list. I want to talk a little bit about Oman if we have time, Malaysia, but I think those can probably take a backseat to Brexit, right? Do you want to touch that at all?
I'll touch it and just say that the House of Lords are having their moment, and they're passing all sorts of amendments that are going to make it more difficult for the May government to push through. And either the May government will, or there'll be some kind of replacement. The May government so far has shown itself, I think, to be more skilled and more adept than most have anticipated.
Save for the interior minister, I forgot her name, but she recently had to recuse herself for some flubs.
But I think in Europe right now, where you have to be looking, besides Germany and France, Italy is the major story right now, because it looks like there's not going to be a government formed in Italy. And so part of the European parliamentary system is that if your first round of elections doesn't work, you just have elections again. You keep repeating the same activity over and over again until you get some kind of compromise.
And pretty much everybody knew this was going to happen, too, after those elections. This gridlock was going to be the name of the game, right?
Yeah, and I mean, when GPF launched back in 2015, the major issue was the Italian economy. We were really worried that the Italian economy was such a weak link. The Italian economy has actually been doing better than we expected, and the European economy has been doing better than we expected for now. The issue now is migrants, and Italy is on the front line of the migrant issue, and that is what is driving a lot of popular discontent and driving these populist parties to power. Now, none of them are powerful enough to form a government on their own, but Italy is sort of ground zero for what it looks like as these fringe parties become not so fringe, become part of the mainstream. We've seen little hints of this in the center in Germany with Alternative for Deutschland, and in France with the success of the National Front. But with Italy, this is all much more serious, and just the fact that they're not able to form a government, looks like they're going into elections again. I don't think that that's going to mean a good thing for the moderating forces in Italy. Probably means a good thing for those populist forces, for those anti-EU forces. Usually when you're going into the summer in Europe, things take a little bit of a breather, but if this is going to be going on, you've also Turkish elections, which has implications coming up in June that affect Europe. Perhaps June and July is not going to be as restful for Europe as it usually is.
Well, I think that's all the time we have, right?
Okay.
That seems like a good time to stop.
That seems like a good time to stop.
And we got to edit this sucker and maybe try and get it out before Trump says one way or another about the Iran deal. Maybe.
I'm going to shoot for it.
So thanks a lot for catching up. Thanks for listening to us ramble yet again. I'm Cole. That's Jacob. We'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time. And as always, check us out at www.geopoliticalfutures.com for more of our compelling thoughts, but also for our more well-reasoned and articulate articles, graphics. And thanks, everyone.
Bye.